everyone, welcome to the March 14th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Milkowski as we are looking back at last weekend's racing from around the country. A lot of focus at Tampa Bay Downs last Saturday, where they ran the Grade 3 Tampa Bay Derby, but also plenty of other graded stakes and stakes action on that card on both the dirt and the turf for 3-year-olds and older horses, and we'll talk about all of that quite a bit, in addition to that interesting performance from Tapit Trice in winning the Tampa Bay Derby. We'll dissect all of the Tampa Bay Downs action before moving on to the other Florida track, Gulfstream Park, where they did run a graded stakes on Saturday. We'll discuss the Hurricane Birdie along with a maiden and allowance race on that same card. At Santa Anita, they actually had some Grade 1 action, the Beholder Mile on Saturday evening. We'll talk about that race in addition to the San Carlos on that same card, though there might have been a higher quality race for that same division at Oaklawn Park the same day as they ran the Grade 2 Azeri, featuring the return of 2 mares from the Breeders' Cup Distaff last year. We'll discuss those horses, and then we'll finish things up with an interesting maiden race, a horse that debuted at Laurel last week. So, Craig, the major focus was in Florida at Tampa Bay Downs, where they ran that Kentucky Derby prep, the only Kentucky Derby prep that offered points from this past weekend. And Tapit Trice, there's been a lot of discussion about his performance in this race. From a speed figure standpoint, this is not going to knock anybody's socks off.
No, it came back just okay, a 110. That's not a huge surprise for a horse who comes from as far back as he does and did once again Saturday, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it. Some of that's of his own doing, as you mentioned it on the forecast this week. He's a horse who just doesn't seem to want to get out of the gate. Uh, I see he's pretty divisive horse. People seem to either love him or really want to knock him because he's not running fast. I myself, I'm probably somewhere in the middle. I'm not willing to just say he's not going to be able to run better races, but I do think there's some pretty big concerns.
There has to be. I mean, my concern going into this race was that he might find some traffic or get a little bit discouraged, finding himself last in a 12-horse field, and that is what happened. But he was ultimately good enough to win this race. But I think you have to take a look at this race on Saturday and be a little bit worried about what would happen in a 20-horse Kentucky Derby if he breaks as slowly as he does and is as sluggish to get into stride as he typically is. I mean, he could be 15, 20 lengths back in the early stages of that race with 19 horses to pass. We're not quite there yet, and we're not handicapping the Kentucky Derby 7 weeks out, but you have to look at this horse's attributes and be a little worried about that stuff, because when you see these horses at the start of their careers show these bad habits, breaking slowly, not racing in the bridle, you hope that from start to start gaining experience, they start to get over those issues as they get more racing under their belts. And I don't see that mental progression happening with Tapit Trice. He seems just as unprofessional now as he was in the first start of his career. And knowing that he's in the Todd Pletcher barn and how diligent Todd Pletcher is with schooling his horses in the morning and making sure they're well prepped to run professional races in the afternoon right from the starts of their careers, I think you have to wonder if maybe this is a horse that just isn't going to get over this stuff.
Yeah, no knocks for me. I mean, the Kentucky Derby's a race that's going to have a speed figure likely in the 120s, at least right around 120. And when you spot horses that many lengths, even with the extra distance, the field size is going to come into play. So it is a little scary given the quality of barn he comes from. And I mean, make no doubts here. Our speed figures, we use pace, the 2-3 finishers around a 109 and a 107. Tapit Trace was much the best horse in here. It's just a question of how often is he going to be able to overcome that trip from way in the back.
Yeah, and I posted some data from GMAX on Twitter, kind of the rare horse who was actually accelerating at the end of a dirt race. And you saw it visually, but it's interesting to see the data because a lot of the times it seems like these horses are accelerating at the end and they're actually slowing down. That typically is what happens in dirt racing, especially dirt routes. Horses just slow down the least quick at the very end of their race. They decelerate the quickest, and that's who wins. But Tapit Trice, I mean, he was actually running his fastest eighth of a mile mile out of the final 3 furlongs in the last furlong of this Tampa Bay Derby, and you could see it at the end. I mean, he really leveled off and hit his stride to run past those pair of classic horses, Classic Car Wash and Classic Legacy, in the final furlong of this race. So definitely a strong finisher. He gives every indication that even more ground is going to be better for him. I mean, it's the cliche. He runs like a Belmont horse, and I mean that might be true, not so much because of the mile-and-a-half distance, but just because in a race like the Belmont, he might have some less traffic to navigate, and the mile-and-a-half oval at Belmont might be more forgiving to a horse like this who has a lot of ground to make up by going wide. So just something to consider for this horse, Tapit Trice. But there is a lot of buzz surrounding him now. Moving on towards the Kentucky Derby, he'll have one more prep likely in the Bluegrass, so we'll see if he can run a more professional race there. But his standing and the standing of everybody else, Craig, definitely does move up a notch, because we did get that news very late on Saturday night that Arabian Knight, the former Bob Baffert trainee who won the Southwest, who was near the top of a lot of people's Kentucky Derby lists, he is off the trail. Had some setbacks, missed some training in February, and his last work was unsatisfactory, so he will not be running in the Kentucky Derby. So that does open things up a little bit for horses that aren't quite running those fast speed figures yet.
Yeah, for sure. And just to hit on the others, I mentioned the 110 speed figure for the winner. There were other dirt routes on the card, so I think it was a pretty easy figure to make, but it is one I need to keep an eye on because nearly every horse in here took a pretty big leap forward. I don't have a lot of concerns about it. These are good, improving 3-year-olds, so we should be seeing some jumps, but some of them are pretty big, and a lot of these horses didn't really look to run visually all that well.
Yeah, I was getting pretty fired up at the quarter pole when I saw Classic Car Wash making that rush to the lead. Looked like a winning move at that point because Tapit Trice was going nowhere at the quarter pole, but you could see once the favorite figured it out that Classic Car Wash was going to get run down, and he did, but he was still a good second at 13-1. Just not sure this Tampa Bay Derby is going to have major implications on the Kentucky Derby beyond the winner, kind of what Craig was getting at there. Let's move on to the other dirt route stakes they ran at Tampa Bay Downs on Saturday. That was the Grade 3 Challenger for the older horses, and we talked about this one quite a bit on the forecast, Craig. Some reasons why you might want to be against the heavy favorite Skippy Longstocking. Unfortunately, the horse that we really wanted to take a shot against him with, Classic Causeway, he scratched out of the race, so that definitely made Skippy Longstocking a more likely winner. And I wouldn't say this performance is going to scare anybody off in the handicap division, but he was good enough to beat this field.
Yeah, I would say so. He ran a 119 speed figure, so a little bit better than he ran last time in the Pegasus, while not running very well. And it just looks like at this point, Skippy Longstocking is basically a grade 3 horse. When he meets these lower level competition, he's kind of a bully, as I mentioned. He beats up on him. He sits right there on the front end and is able to run him down. He's yet to be able to reproduce that at higher levels. So at this point, that's just how I'm going to view him. I had mentioned Tax, who was the runner-up. He got a 115 for the runner-up position, as did Surly Furious. I know a horse you were interested in, and actually looked like he might be a winner, turning for home and with about a furlong to go, as he took the lead on the inside. But yeah, these horses, they're just grade 3 types, was exactly what the Challenger was.
Yeah, Surly Furious getting out-nosed for second was a little painful for me at the end of this race, but he did give me a little bit of a thrill there, slipping through on the inside at the top of the stretch. And yeah, I mean, I was reaching a little bit on the forecast, trying to make the case against Skippy Longstocking, but sometimes when you're playing these sequences, you have to have a point of view going in, and I just made that decision that if Skippy Longstocking won, I was going to be content with losing, and that's the way that it goes. I'm not upset about it. You can be wrong about 1 to 2 shots and not feel so bad most of the time.
Yeah, I did want to mention the pick five. I know Friday you brought up that it was a low takeout pick five, but that payout was pretty nuts for a race that had four very heavy favorites win. Or the one winner that we're going to talk about that wasn't the favorite, only paid $5, 5-1, $12 even, and the thing paid $184, almost 6 times the parlay. I have no idea how that happened. It was one of the crazier payoffs I've ever seen.
Yeah, I will say that 5-1 winner, as you know, she was a much bigger price for almost all of wagering and got hit down to 5-1 in the last flash. So I wonder if that horse played a little more like a bigger price in a sequence like the pick five. We'll talk about that race in just a bit, but first let's talk about another one of the graded stakes that was run on the turf at Tampa Bay Downs on Saturday. That was the Grade 2 Hillsborough. This one for the fillies and mares going a mile and an eighth. And Craig, we had handicapped this race for DRF last week and talked about how there was quite a bit of quality in this field. And Shantasara was able to get the job done here, kicking off her 5-year-old campaign. And if this filly, or I should say mare, can stay sound for 2023, she could have a pretty big year for Chad Brown because she showed a lot of quality during her 3-year-old season, obviously has had some trouble staying on the racetrack, but what I really liked about this performance was that she was able to show improved tactical speed to sit right on top of the pace, and that really gave her an edge over her foes.
Yeah, that was important. We talked about the pace projector on our preview and how we had Shani Sara second, and I don't think either one of us were really sure she'd be there. It was just kind of by default, but she was there and she earned it because it's not like Scottish Star was walking on the front end, and I think it's a pretty good thing that she was because Scottish Star got the lone lead that we thought she might. But she was really game in the lane and fought until about the last furlong of the race before Shani Sara just exerted her class over her. Ran a 120 speed figure for the win, so good effort. That seems to be her wheelhouse. Most of her races are in the low 20s, and she's still got room to grow, I think, if she can stay healthy and kind of put a campaign together, which we haven't really seen from her yet.
Yeah, at the end of the day, she was probably just classier than these horses and got the job done here. Good effort from the third place finisher, surprisingly. She got a perfect trip, saving ground on the rail, but I like the way that she finished at the end. She was getting to that leader, Scottish Star, as they came onto the wire, just missing second, and just seems like the kind of Shug McGahey trainee that's been taking a step forward with every single start. Has gotten perfect trips twice in a row, but definitely seems like one that's improving. And Craig, both of the price horses that we were interested in, I think the board kind of told the story on our horses as they both were very chilly in the wagering, particularly Gam's Mission, and probably just a horse that needed a race off the layoff, and maybe we'll see better from her next time.
Yeah, I'm a little down on her given Cherie DeVos stats off the layoff. I expected better, and she didn't really run well, but I don't want to totally write her off. Temple City Terror, kind of the same. Maybe it is a distance. We'll see. I imagine they're going to stretch her back out. I wouldn't write her off yet either. The filly I would write off is Rougier, the other Chad Brown. She was also kind of cold on the board, went off 7-1, and just showed that she's really not that grade one horse that she has the credential, but she doesn't really run those kind of races.
Yeah, I will say if there's a trip horse I'd bet out of this race, it would be Gam's Mission. She just did not get the ride that I think you would desire in a race like this, going 4 wide around both turns. That's probably not going to be successful in a 7-horse field like this. So maybe one that I would be looking to give another shot to next time out.
Yeah, you did caution me about the pilot on that one.
Well, I think he had a big win at Gulfstream Park, so I don't want to be I don't want to be too hard on him. Let's move on to the Grade 3 Florida Oaks. That was the other turf stakes on this card for the female horses. This one for the 3-year-old fillies, and this is the one that I was talking about, Greg. Mission of Joy, a horse that I know both you and I were interested in this race, and I'll give both of us a little pat on the back here because we nailed this one pretty well when we did our stakes preview last week with our picks and the price horses that we were interested in this race. And Mission of Joy, we had talked about it last week, just seemed like a horse that even though she was beating inferior competition, had been so much better than those horses and had really shown some quality in those races at Tampa Bay Downs earlier in the season. She was able to make that jump up in class to beat a tougher field here.
Yeah, it was a very good effort for her. Both her and the runner-up, Alpha Bella, are going to get 108 time form US speed figures, and I just really like what I saw from Mission of Joy. The way she was able to rate in behind horses. Obviously, from the rail, she didn't have a wide trip on the first turn, but that move she made to take the lead. Antonio Gallardo, he wasn't shy with her. He just took her out and made that one big run, and it was impressive. I mean, she was just gobbling up ground. Even though she only won by a neck, to me, she always looked like the winner of the race. And you alluded to it a little bit earlier. The only real disappointment was the payoff, and that I think this horse was about 13-1 as they loaded. And he got $12 even for this opinion.
Yeah, that's always a little disappointing to see. We'd hope to have less of that going on at racetracks. And again, neither of us are suggesting there's anything nefarious going on. I'd advise you to read some of the work that's been done by Pat Cummings, who writes about this a lot, and the impact that the late odds flashes have from the groups that play and the CRW wagers, which is a big factor at tracks like Tampa Bay Downs, especially in the win pool. You'll see those big swings at the very end, and it's unfortunate because the average players sometimes take the worst of it, and Mission of Joy did get hit down to 5-1 at the very end, but maybe a horse like her should have been lower than 5-1 based on the way that she won, because she was much the best in this race. And you mentioned Antonio Gallardo. He rode her like the best horse. Even though he drew the rail, he was not afraid to come off the inside and get outside of horses going around that second turn, going wide, just making sure that he was going to have that clear run when it mattered, because he knew this horse has a big finish on her. And I love the way that she leveled off and lowered her head in the stretch and was able to beat a very game Alphabella, who was trying to battle back at the very end. Also, a good call from you, Craig, on the number 8, Juniper's Moon, who was third in here. She did go off at a big price, 28-1, and was able to hold on for third after contesting the pace and validating that nice speed figure that she had earned in her maiden victory in the prior start.
Yeah, she was pretty game. I mean, she almost held on for second. It was a good effort from her. She took the lead in the stretch. Just wasn't quite able to hold off the others, improved their speed figure up to a 106. So she's definitely a filly with some talent. As you mentioned, that maiden race she comes out with, I don't think that she came out of. I don't think that we've heard the end of that. I think it was a pretty strong race. And I did want to mention Free Look. I thought she ran fine. She was clearly disadvantaged by the post position. So I'm not going to write her off. I would definitely give her another shot with a better draw. And she's probably not one of the top fillies in the division, but she's pretty good.
Yeah, we've talked about it before, Craig. I think we mentioned it on the forecast last week. People just assume that horses coming out of these Breeders' Cup juvenile turf races are the best in the division, and that's not always the case, because sometimes the horses that run in those races, at least among the Americans, are just the horses that are ready for that challenge at the time. But a lot can transpire over the winter, different horses can emerge, and, we're going to talk about some of the 3-year-old male turf horses now, and a lot of the best ones out there didn't even run in the Breeders' Cup or hadn't even broken their maidens at that time last year. So a lot can change over the wintertime, and maybe some of the horses that ran in that Breeders' Cup and just ran decent races have since been usurped from an overall ability standpoint. Speaking of that, let's move on to the 3-year-old male turfers. They ran in the Columbia earlier on that Tampa Bay Downs card on Saturday, and safe to say, Craig, I think this was the biggest speed figure we saw from any 3-year-old on either surface this past weekend, as Talk of the Nation came through with a big performance in his second time on the turf, now 2 for 2 on that surface, to beat what was a pretty solid field.
Yeah, this is one that gave me some angst making this speed figure, but short of just breaking it out because I don't believe a 3-year-old could run that fast, all the evidence pointed to it was a very fast race, and it was also a very even paced race based on the pace figure. So it's not one where I could say, oh, it was a really fast pace. Maybe that contributed to the final time. So it was a case where I just went with the numbers. And you mentioned this week, I think that might be the fastest 3-year-old figure we've seen all year at 119, which is what Talk of the Nation is going to get. And make no mistake, he destroyed this field. It was never really in doubt. He did it from a tough post position. And this horse just looks like a really good one. It's certainly one I'll be keeping a close eye on the speed figure, but it was one I really didn't have a lot of options unless I just wanted to guess and say he's not that good. And that seems to me like it would be kind of silly given how fast he ran and how good he looked.
Yeah, Greg, I know this is something you've talked about before, but I think one of the difficulties with making turf speed figures is, unlike on dirt, you're never going to have these gigantic gaps between runners at the finish. So a horse like Talk of the Nation might be a 119 speed figure kind of horse, but you're not going to see horses like this win by 10 or 12 lengths on the turf like they might on the dirt if they were that far superior to their competition. So I feel like the number might be more legitimate for the winner than it is for some that finished in behind. But just the way that speed figures work, you have to respect the margins between the horses. So you might see some inflated numbers for the 4th and 5th place finishers, and I might take those with a grain of salt more so than I would the big number for the winner.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm always a little more leery of horses that don't win or aren't even really competitive at the wire. And you could even say that for the run-up, the runner-up, who ran a fine race. But I mean, at the end of the day, he was beaten 2.5 lengths by a horse who did it pretty easily. So yeah, he gets a 116 in second. That's a figure if he ran a horse, against a horse who maybe had been running a 110 but winning, I would certainly wouldn't have any problems taking on.
Yeah, and I make that point because Talk of the Nation, even though he only won by 2.5 lengths, and I gotta say only 2.5 lengths is quite a margin on the turf. I mean, he did it the hard way. He was outside, pressing it on his pace, losing ground around the turns. And I had mentioned it on the forecast last week that he's not a horse with a big turn of foot, but he just keeps ratcheting up the speed on his competition and is able to grind away from his foes. And you saw it in the stretch here. It's not like he burst away in an instant, but he just kept ratcheting up that speed, and you could see the others just one by one came off the bridle and couldn't go with him, and he was really finishing powerfully as they came across the wire. So I get the impression that he is not just a miler. He's the kind of horse that is going to be able to handle some added ground in the future. I think his dam could certainly go longer. His dam, she's not here. I believe she won the yellow ribbon out in California, was a good turf horse that could go a mile and an eighth, maybe even a mile and a quarter. So definitely a big future for Talk of the Nation, and he is not the only talented 3-year-old turf horse out there. We're going to talk about at least one more in just a little bit. And speaking of that, let's move on to Gulfstream Park and discuss some racing there from last Saturday and the past weekend. The feature race on that Saturday card, Craig, was the Grade 3 Hurricane Birdie. This one going 6.5 furlongs on the dirt for the fillies and mares. And I don't know what happened to Frank's Rocket in the Breeders' Cup. Obviously, she didn't show up that day, but if you throw out that Breeders' Cup performance, she has just been in the best form of her career for the past half a year or so.
Yeah, I don't know what happened to her either that day, and if memory serves, I better, but she's certainly gotten pretty good of late. She was a horse who was having trouble finding the winner's circle. I had kind of written her off, and then I remember seeing her in person at Charlestown and just really being impressed by the way she ran and how professional she was. And she just seems like she's a new horse these days, and she's running fast and she's running well, and she's gotten over those can't find the winner circle for sure. I don't have the official speed figure. I'm guessing it's going to be right around a 119 or so. Could be a couple points higher, a couple points lower. It was a tough day at Gulfstream. They're not running a whole lot of dirt races these days. There were a whole bunch of synthetic races on the card, but there were only two dirt sprints. And if I was making the speed figure, which I'm not, I would not rate those two sprint races. They were both at 6.5 furlongs, but there was a turf race in between them. It looks like a breakout to me, like a split variant to me, where they were just run over two completely different racetracks. Putting them together would make the two races both look highly suspicious. So I'm guessing that's what my assistant is going to do, and I think that 119 is going to be pretty close to what he does.
Yeah, what Greg is referring to, the other 6.5 furlong race, I think it went 0.42 seconds faster than Frank's Rocket did winning the Hurricane Birdie, and that was just an optional claiming 25 nominators of one allowance race. Kind of hard to believe that the two horses that hit the wire together in that race would have run faster than Frank's Rocket, so it did seem like something changed with the dirt course on Saturday at Gulfstream Park late in the day. And as for Frank's Rocket, I mean, she won by 8 lengths. Seemed like it could have been 12 or 15. I mean, she was geared down at the end, never asked for anything close to her best. And I mean, she had run a big number in her prior start at Gulfstream, getting a 121, had gotten a 125 final time number that day, which was knocked down due to a slow pace. And I mean, she's just in a different league than the horses that she's facing here. Has won these 2 stakes at Gulfstream this winter by a combined 20 lengths. So if she's able to hold this form, she's going to be a major force in this sprint division moving forward. Let's move on to another Bill Mott trainee. Not in a stakes race just yet, but we did see a debut win from Empire Strikes Fast earlier in the day on Saturday at Gulfstream Park. Now, this horse was going the 1.16 distance on debut, which is not easy to do, 2 turns on the dirt for a first-time starter, and he was facing a pretty good horse in the runner-up Dreamlike, who took all the money. Unsurprisingly, he had run a very nice speed figure in his career debut, but Craig, Empire Strikes Fast, he just kept finding more on the inside of that foe, battling back, and was pretty game to get the job done here in his first start.
Yeah, and it was a race which was pretty much a match race, as it was far back to third. There was a horse, Safi Joseph horse, that led for a little more than a half mile, I think, and then these two just took over and kind of put on a show. And Empire Strikes Fast was pretty game to the wire, as you mentioned. This is another one that's a tough call. It was the only dirt route on the day, I believe. I'm gonna guess he's gonna get about a 112 time form US speed figure, which is pretty darn good. I mean, we already talked about the Tampa Bay Derby, where the winner that a lot of people are talking about as one of the top Derby contenders only ran a 110. So obviously, this horse is a little bit behind the learning curve, having obviously just started in early March. Seems like it would be a bit of a stretch to get this horse to the Derby, but I imagine stakes race would probably be in the future very soon.
Yeah, and I was just looking it up. He is not Triple Crown nominated, so they'd have to rectify that if they were going to try a Derby prep with him. It seems a little bit late, and Bill Mott is not the kind of trainer that rushes these horses along, so I would imagine he's not going to be one that is on the Derby trail and probably not even on the Triple Crown trail. But clearly, this is a talented horse. Kind of slipped through the cracks, Craig, going off at 23 to 1. You don't often see that from horses that are first time starters for a major barn like Bill Mott. Somebody just not having some heads up that the horse has some talent. But I mean, maybe Vasquez riding this horse threw some people off because he's not one of Bill Mott's go-to jockeys. But clearly the word was not out on this guy. Obviously has ability. He really did battle back gamely, and it's a little bit easier to have some confidence in the higher speed figure when there's an 8+ length gap back to the third place finisher behind these two horses. So they really did pull away from the rest of the field, and unlucky for Dreamlike, who has run really well in both career starts, yet remains a maiden. He's a well-bred horse who probably is not going to be a maiden for that long and might have stakes in his future, but he's run into two Bill Mott trainees that have just been a little bit better than him, as he was beaten by Arthur's Ride, who I believe got a 114 when he beat this horse on debut. So seems like a pretty high-quality maiden race at Gulfstream Park on Saturday. Let's move on to another 3-year-old running on a different surface, the turf, as we saw heavily favored Far Bridge win the second start of his career in an N1X allowance race a little bit later in the day at Gulfstream Park on Saturday. And Greg, we've talked a lot about the maiden race that he was exiting, where he just barely got the job done over Carl Spackler, as the two of them drew over 6 lengths clear of the third place finisher in that January 21st maiden race at Gulfstream, another 6 lengths back to fourth. You just don't see margins like that on the turf, and the race had come back almost unbelievably fast for a January 3-year-old maiden race, and we wanted to see some confirmation of that speed figure. Well, Carl Spackler came back and was as impressive as you could be, breaking his maiden in his next start with a nice speed figure, and we just saw Far Bridge come back and validate that performance. He didn't run quite as fast, but from a visual standpoint, you had to love the different gears that this horse displayed, knifing his way through the pack.
Yeah, this is one of those years where it might be wise to get excited about the 3-year-old turf horses. There was a time in horse racing where we would never even see these horses on turf. They would all be on dirt until much later in the year, and barns are doing things differently now. Obviously, there's way more opportunities on the grass, and we're seeing some horses being bred specifically for the grass. They start on the grass, which is something you almost never saw. And I think we've got some really good ones here. And you mentioned Carl Spackler, who came back with a 112 second time out. Far Bridge, this is another one. The turf figures were tough as well, but I'm guessing he's going to get a 107, but I wouldn't make that number too much. It looked like he was just being ridden to get to the wire first, not to win by 5 lengths. Maybe he was being taught a few things, but I really liked how he was put in behind horses, and just everything he did was so professional. He just looked like much the best horse, even though he was well, he won by 3.5 lengths, but he was way back early on and just had this field at his mercy. It was really impressive.
Yeah, I was having a debate with somebody about which of these horses ran better in that career debut race, Carl Spackler or Far Bridge. And somebody was making the case that Carl Spackler was the one that attacked the pace, so he had a right to get run down, and he's the better horse. And I mean, I was kind of making the case that that was a race where nobody was doing any running from the back of the pack. If anything, the leaders were pulling away from the closers, and Far Bridge was the only one that was making up ground into some pretty fast closing splits. And I was kind of amazed that he was able to get up that day. And we saw his strong closing kick on display again here. Obviously, even though he was stepping up against winners, probably wasn't facing any rivals of anything near that quality. But I mean, the way that he finishes off his races is really impressive. He's not the most robust horse, but you could just see looking at him. He's so athletic. He's got this great extension to his stride, and just get the sense this is a high quality horse. And I mean, great to see another top runner for English Channel, who of course passed away recently, and this is probably one of the final crops of English Channels. And great to see Calumet Farm, who stood English Channel for so many years, get rewarded with a homebred by him that might be one of the best he's ever produced.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun story to follow, and seems like he's a sound horse. He's already run twice. I hope he stays on the track and we get to see, because it's going to be exciting this year, but with all of the top 3-year-olds we've seen, and there's probably a few more out there. But make no mistake, we're seeing some speed figures we don't usually see on grass this early.
Well, we'll stay on the turf and move back to Friday, where they ran an allowance race for the older horses. And Chad Brown has a European import that might be seen in some stakes later in the year. Dr. Zemph, who got the job done in his U.S. debut here, first start for the Chad Brown barn. This Peter Brandt-owned runner had been running for Peter Brandt in Europe, and trainer changed to Chad Brown to start a U.S. campaign here. We'll see how good this horse turns out to be, Craig. Definitely did everything right in his U.S. debut, but wasn't beating the strongest field that we're ever going to see.
No, he wasn't, but he ran a 119 speed figure, which is pretty good. You would need to take some steps forward to compete with males in graded stakes company, but nothing told me it can happen. It wasn't the most ambitious placing in this spot to go in just 7.5 furlongs. So, in my opinion, the jury's still out on him. It was just I guess, a weak allowance race, I would say, for the kind of purse money they were running for.
And he was much the best. I'll be interested to see how far this horse wants to go in the future. He was a grade 1 place 2-year-old, but going 6 furlongs over in Europe, and hadn't been successful trying to get a mile. I think the one time that he did in Europe last year has been more of a 6 to 7 furlong type over there. This race was 7.5 furlongs, and he's by Dark Angel, who's more of a sprinter to miler sire. I'll be interested to see how far he wants to go. Visually, he looks a little more compactly built, like a horse that probably doesn't want to go a step beyond a mile, and maybe he can get a mile in this country, just given the quicker nature of these route races in the U.S. So we'll see what kind of horse he turns out to be, but definitely an exciting horse in the Chad Brown stable, and stable that often has a lot of exciting turf horses. Let's move on to Sunday at Gulfstream Park, back over to the dirt course, where they ran a high-level allowance race as the feature there late in the day. Milliken, a horse that had turned a lot of heads towards the start of his career, Craig, when he was running some nice speed figures, and arguably had been a little bit of a disappointment, never quite able to build upon those races. Stretched out to 2 turns for the first time here, and I thought delivered one of the best efforts that we've ever seen out of him.
Well, speed figure wise, I would guess it is going to be his best effort. I'm saying he's probably going to get about a 119 time form US speed figure. Um, yeah, I was a little bit surprised, to be honest. Maybe I had just thought he was a one-turn horse because they had never really tried it, but this was pretty impressive. Even though he only won by 3/4 of a length, it was a pretty big gap back to third place. The horses in behind were horses who are routinely running 110 type and low 1 speed figures. So I thought it was a good effort from him, and I look forward to seeing him. And we've talked about the older horse division plenty. There's not a whole lot of quality out there right now. So who knows where this one could show up, but he would certainly fit in stakes with the type of speed figure he ran on Sunday.
Yeah, just to review, I mean, this horse had won his debut race at Ellis Park back in 2021 by 8 lengths, and then had come back at his next start and engaged in a duel to the wire with Olympiad in an N1X race at Keeneland. And obviously, Olympiad's gone on to do some very nice things since then. He's become a multiple graded stakes winner, was, I believe, second in the Breeders' Cup Classic. I mean, he is turned into a top horse. Milliken has never won since that race until this past Sunday, or I should say until he came back at Gulfstream in January, and now he's won his second start of 2023 on Sunday. So clearly their paths diverged, but seems like Milliken might finally be figuring things out. He was gelded towards the end of last year, and now since being gelded, it seems like he's gained a new level of consistency. So nice to see him put these big performances back to back, and I would imagine it will soon be on to stakes company for him. Let's move on to Santa Anita, and we'll talk about what I think was the only Grade 1 race run this past week, and that was the Beholder Mile on Saturday for the fillies and mares going the 1 mile distance on the dirt. And Craig, while this was a Grade 1, and there was a race for this same division at Oaklawn Park on Saturday that was a Grade 2, this was probably the weaker of the two races. The heavy favorite coming in was the Bob Baffert trained Fun to Dream, who had been in great form in Southern California. I mean, primarily running in sprint races, but I understood why she took a lot of the money coming in here, though it was one of the shippers, Mo Ray, going out for the Brad Cox stable, who was able to upset that Bob Baffert runner, and Mo Ray has just really turned her career around since coming into the Brad Cox barn.
She has, and hats off to Brad Cox for knowing it was time to get out of Dodge with his filly, who had won the last prep, the Grade 3 Bayakoa. I think he probably realized the competition was going to be easy in this Grade 1, much easier than what we saw at Oaklawn on Saturday. And he was able to get the job done with a Mo Ray, who going to get about a 114 speed figure. So one of the weaker Grade 1s that you're ever going to see, but it was a wise move by the trainer. I'll leave it at that because I didn't think a whole lot of this field. I mean, Fun to Dream, she's a cool filly. Calbred, who had won all of her races but one, I think, done so pretty easily. But it seemed like they were really pushing it, moving up in this class. She ran fine, but it's just not a very strong Grade 1.
Yeah, I mean, I saw a lot of chatter online about how could a Mo Ray be a Grade 1 winner. Well, I think she ran to the competition, but the competition also, to some extent, ran down to her level. She did run the best speed figure of her career here, and is definitely a horse that's moving up in the right direction. And Brad Cox has obviously gotten something out of her that Todd Pletcher couldn't, because she was with a top barn prior to this and just never really delivered upon expectations. But don't mistake her for one of the best runners in this division. She has a long way to go to get there, even though she is a Grade 1 winner in this race. And I thought that Fun to Dream had every chance to win, Craig. Came into the stretch looking like she was going to win this race by maybe 2 lengths or more. I mean, she was pulling away from Mo Ray, but it seemed like the distance might have caught up to her. I mean, she had really gained her reputation running in 7 furlong races. And while she had beaten weaker in a 2-turn race at Santa Anita last year, she was doing against tougher company here, and it just seemed like she hit a wall in the final furlong.
Yeah, exactly. Her best distances are clearly shorter than this. I didn't mention, I think the speed figure is going to come back about a 114. All these races, I don't have official speed figures. I will certainly post on Twitter later on today.
Let's move on to the other graded stakes run on this Saturday card at Santa Anita, going the 7 furlong distance for the older males. That was the Grade 3 San Carlos, and I think we have an emerging talented sprinter here, Craig, in Spirit of Makina, who is a very lightly raced 5-year-old, just making the 4th start of his career here. I believe we had talked about his allowance victory last time on the Pacecast, reviewing that race, because it had gotten a nice speed figure. And this race, he's not earning a figure that's going to scare away anybody in the sprint division, but this sprint division is totally wide open. And he's a horse that could do some damage in these races, especially out west, given the way these races have come up over the past couple of seasons.
Yeah, he's a horse who keeps moving forward, so I don't want to knock him on the speed figures. I'm guessing he's only going to get about a 113, but a lot of that is because of this very slow pace early on. This horse was really flying home. I don't have the exact figures in front of me. The final time figure is going to be a 119, so that 6 point gap is pretty big when you talk about a horse who he just really finished off his race. I haven't looked at the fractions, but it seemed like he came home in good time. He beat Forbidden Kingdom, a horse who's fast, just one that doesn't seem to be able to finish off his races. Hard to believe he was a horse who was very high up on the Kentucky Derby trail after winning the San Felipe wire to wire, but just seems like he's a horse who doesn't want to go. He's fast, but he just can't seem to finish. So I'd knock Spirit of Makina a little bit for that because the horses he was beating. But on the other hand, Getter Number, who was back in third, he's pretty good. He didn't run very well in the Pegasus. And nobody really knew why he was in that race. But he was a horse who nearly was able to take the Cigar Mile. So it's not like Spirit of Makina was beating nobody. I think he's one with a future, as you say, and still moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, I'm being a little optimistic on him just given how lightly raced he is. And he is 5 years old, so I mean, it's not like he's a horse that has a lot of maturing left to do. But we just haven't seen very much of him, and he's close to being undefeated. His only loss was when they tried to go a two-turn mile with him at Del Mar, and he just barely got run down. So he's a horse that has a lot of talent. The sprint races are going to get tougher, especially if he eventually moves up to grade one level competition. So we'll see how good he turns out to be. I kind of have a different take on Forbidden Kingdom, Craig. I would love to see them stretch this horse back out in distance because I think he's at his best when he can do what he did in that San Felipe, where he just bottoms out a field and sets some fast fractions and keeps going. These sprint races, sometimes these horses, that even though they have natural speed, they have to use it earlier than they really want to. And he's not a horse that has some kind of turn of foot or ability to reaccelerate once he starts to decelerate. So I think the sprint races sometimes can be tough for these horses. So I'd love to see them at least get the chance to go longer again and use that running style, just opening up on the field like he did in that San Felipe victory last year. So we'll see. I'm sure Richard Mandela is considering that. They know that he gained his reputation running in that race. So we'll see what we get from him moving forward. But I'd be curious to see him go longer in the future.
Oh yeah, I definitely second that. I am not optimistic it would work, but it's certainly worth taking a shot given that's where we saw his best performance.
I want to talk about one more race from this Saturday card at Santa Anita. It was a 3-year-old maiden race going the mile and a 16th distance, won by I Don't Get It. And just want to mention this race having some potential Derby implications, probably not for the horses in here, but maybe for Skinner, who most of these horses finished behind when they ran in a February 12th maiden race at Santa Anita. Obviously, we saw Skinner come back and run pretty well in the San Felipe next time, finishing third, but I think this definitely bolsters the high speed figure that Skinner had gotten for that maiden victory because all of these horses came back to run pretty well, particularly the first and second place finishers, I Don't Get It and Yellow Brick. And I Don't Get It feels like a horse that might have a future, Craig. This was just the third start of his career. He's been highly regarded. He was actually the favorite in that race, won by Skinner and stumbled at the start that day, so probably didn't have his best chance. And I think he's one that might be okay.
Yeah, I think he's pretty good. He's probably going to match his speed figure he ran last time of about 107. Again, I don't have the official number on that, but it was a pretty strong race, particularly from the top two, who were the 3-4 finishers in that Skinner race. So he's definitely one with some potential. And, with these 3-year-olds, there's usually not a lot of moving through conditions. So I don't know if they'll give him a shot. It seems like it'd be a little late to try the Triple Crown Trail, but he's certainly moving towards stakes company.
Let's move on to Oaklawn Park, and just one race to talk about there, Craig, but for me, this might have been the race of the weekend. This matchup between Secret Oath and Clairiere in the Grade 2 Azeri, that local prep for the Grade 1 Apple Blossom, and I hope that we see both of them show up there, because this didn't turn out to be much of a matchup at all, as Secret Oath was just superior on the day to her main rival. Arguably, they had different goals coming into this race. Secret Oath going out for a Dwayne Lucas Barn, who is experiencing a resurgence this winter at Oaklawn Park. He's had a lot of winners, a lot of nice performances. Clairiere, a horse that sometimes can be a little bit slower to come around and maybe just using this as a prep, but I was really impressed with what I saw from Secret Oath coming off the layoff. Just a much stronger finish than we had seen from her, especially in the second half of the season last year. It looked like she had kind of taken some wear and tear from all that racing, but just seemed like a renewed, refreshed horse off the layoff coming back for her 4-year-old season.
I would agree. She was a filly who never really got a break last year. She kind of flattened out in speed figures. I know we both kind of had gone against her once she wasn't able to beat Ness. She wasn't taking that forward move. And it showed in her results. It's not like she was winning her races and running the similar speed figures. So I was impressed by this one. It was a race that basically featured no pace whatsoever. So maybe the finish is a little bit exaggerated because she should have had plenty of energy left. And the front runners in here were not very good. Lovely Ride, who set the pace, finished well back. But Secret Oath is going to get about a 120 speed figure, which, well, she did get a 120. This one's official. Career high for her. The final time figure was actually a 124. I would want to, normally I would say the how easily she beat Clairiere. Maybe you could chalk it up to the pace, but it's not like she was that far in front of Clairiere. She rated well off the pace as well and just never looked like a loser in the stretch. So I would agree, maybe Clairiere wasn't fully cranked, where it's pretty likely Secret Oath probably was, but maybe the gap would be closer. But I was impressed by both the top two.
Yeah, I mean, these pace figure lines for the top two finishers in this race, Craig, I can't recall seeing very many dirt races that look like that shape, where these horses are basically running sub 100 pace figures for the entire race and then suddenly accelerate enough to get speed figures of 120, which is what Secret Oath is getting for the victory here, actually knocked down a little bit from a 124 final time figure. I mean, they were finishing truly like a turf race at the very end here. And what I loved was how confidently Tyler Gaffalione rode Secret Oath. I believe this was the first time that he was getting on her, and clearly he had watched her races and knew what kind of horse she was, because she broke slowly, as she does sometimes, and he didn't panic, just let her settle towards the back of the pack. You could see that she was really relaxed, moving easily down the backstretch, not getting so rank like she sometimes did last year under different riders, and coming to the top of the stretch, I mean, you could see she was going to win this race for fun. They turned into the stretch, and he was still just sitting chilly on her, never asked her for much, basically niggled at her at the 3/16 pole, and she went clear so easily. I don't want to take anything away from Clairiere, though, Craig. Even though she lost this race, she was farther behind in the early stages. Unlike Secret Oath, had some traffic to navigate in the stretch, and once she got into the clear, she did a lot of running to get up into second, because at the top of the stretch, it looked like she had no chance to even hit the board, given how slow the pace was. So I thought this was an encouraging return for both of these horses.
Yeah, I would agree. And I also wanted to mention the third place finisher, Interstate Daydream, who's going to be overshadowed a little bit, and rightfully so, by the top two. But we hadn't seen her since August. She had a pretty impressive season as a 3-year-old, had run some nice races, a couple graded stakes wins. And she came back okay too, ran a 115. Maybe she wasn't fully cranked as well. It's Brad Cox trainee. We mentioned he sent a Mo Ray out west and sent this one here. So I'm sure he knew what kind of competition there was. And I would expect a little better from her next time as well. I would guess we're going to see these horses in the Apple Blossom. My only regret is that race is only a mile and a 16th now. So I don't think that's going to do Courier any favors if that's where she shows up.
Well, I think that's going to depend on the pace quite a bit. She's just a very pace-dependent horse. She's always going to find herself towards the back of the pack early, and will need some help up front. Secret Oath, if she breaks well, she's just a little more tractable. So, and she's got that turn of foot that Clairiere maybe lacks a little bit. So it's going to be an interesting matchup once again. Clearly, Secret Oath is in great form right now. The key for her will be whether or not she can maintain this form through the rest of the year. Wasn't able to do so last year. She was so cranked up early in the season and just kind of petered out in the second half of the year. We'll see if she's able to continue doing this well. And Dwayne Lucas made it sound like her regular rider, Luis Saez, might have lost out on this mount. He, in the post-race quotes, was saying that Tyler Gaffalione rode her so well that he's probably going to be on her again in the Apple Blossom. And I really can't blame him, because they seem to make a great team in this Azeri victory. So talk about one more race before we close out this edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast, and that was a maiden race on Friday at Laurel Park, the only race that we're going to talk about from Laurel this past week, Craig. And we've been talking quite a bit about how these 3-year-old fillies are not running very fast speed figures, especially in stakes company. Well, we saw a 3-year-old filly debut on Friday at Laurel that might have stakes in her future very soon, and that is a horse named Good Girl Bad Habits for the Brittany Russell barn, and couldn't ask a horse to win her first race much easier than this filly.
No, and she definitely ran a good speed figure. She's going to get a 110, winning by over a dozen lengths. She just popped the gate, was way clear, and kept expanding the margin all the way to the wire. I mean, it's so far back, the runner up. I only got an 83 Timeform US speed figure. So obviously the jury's still out on how far this horse wants to go, on what the quality of the field was there. The horse who was the 2-1 second choice behind the winner had only run an 81 previously. So yeah, it's not like it was a strong field. It was just the sprint, but at least we saw a horse run a fast race, and this definitely was one with that 110.
Yeah, there probably wasn't a whole lot behind her, but maybe that doesn't matter so much when a horse wins by 13 lengths. She was pretty impressive winning this race, just geared down at the end, really never asked for her best. And from a pedigree standpoint, contrary to the visual that we saw with her showing so much speed, she actually is bred to go longer. She's by Mastery, whose progeny have not been that precocious. They've kind of wanted to go longer distances. And on the dam side, she's a half sister to a horse named Dazzling Gem, who was actually third in the Louisiana Derby. So there is pedigree for this one to go longer, though she showed so much speed on debut. It'll be interesting to see if she's able to harness it to get some longer distances. But she's one that I imagine we would see in stakes company pretty soon, and definitely seems like a filly with quite a bit of talent. Well, that's all the racing to discuss on the Pacecast this week, Craig. This is the rare weekend at this time of year coming up where there are no Kentucky Derby prep races, just a little bit of a lull in that prep schedule. So we don't have to really consider that when we look ahead to the TimeformUS forecast this upcoming week. I've seen the card at Oaklawn. They've got a couple of very interesting stakes races on Saturday. Maybe we'll do that for the forecast. I have to wait and see how some of the other cards that draw a little bit later in the week come up, but we'll find which sequence works best and look forward to discussing that on the forecast a bit later in the week.
Yeah, I haven't looked ahead. It's kind of interesting. There's no prep races this week for the Derby. You kind of jolted me earlier. I didn't hear when you said it's still 7 weeks to the Kentucky Derby because I'm thinking, oh my God, it's only 7 weeks to the Kentucky Derby. Time seems to be flying by, and outside of Forte, who's done everything you could ask of him so far, it seems like a pretty muddled Derby picture.
Yeah, I mean, from a wagering standpoint, I never mind that. I love a wide open Kentucky Derby when it's a great betting race, but I agree. We haven't seen those standouts, at least from a speed figure standpoint yet. None of the 3-year-olds are kind of breaking up into that upper echelon of 120 plus TimeformUS speed figures like we sometimes see with prohibitive Derby favorites. So I'm sure we're going to learn a lot more about them in the final round of preps, which will kick off March 25th with the Louisiana Derby, UAE Derby, the Sunland Park Derby, and the Jeff Ruby Stakes. And from there on out, it's going to be coming fast and furious at us as far as those 100-point preps go. So we'll learn a lot more about who's going to be in the Kentucky Derby field then. But until then, we're going to look forward to this upcoming weekend in racing, and Craig and I will decide what we're going to handicap a little bit later in the week. So everybody, thanks for tuning in to this TimeformUS Pacecast. Remember, you can always catch these TimeformUS podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for tuning in this week, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS forecast coming up later in the week.